Okay, welcome to another Mrs. H psychology revision video. This time it's on the one of the approaches, the behaviourist approach. So this is in your paper 2 for AQA psychology, and I've just put the mind map on the screen now. In general, I'm just going to take off some of the detail and talk through it and zoom in on certain areas. Okay, but just so you've got an idea of what I'm going to cover and how much space to take up. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to start with the key assumptions, and then I'm going to talk specifically about classical conditioning, then operant, differences between them, and then evaluating. So we're going to zoom in here on the key assumptions of the behaviourist approach. Okay, so we'll start with number 1, environmental determinism. What do we mean by environmental determinism? Well, we know that when we talk about determinism, it means that all of our behaviours have been preset for us in some form. Here, the behaviourists believe in environmental determinism. In other words, that they believe that we are, as we've got here, a tabula rasa at birth, meaning that we are a blank slate, and that all that we have become is the result of experience and learning. So environmental determinism, that we are a blank slate and we are the result of all our experiences. So clearly this supports the nurture argument in the nature-nurture debate. The second key term the second key assumption or key term that we can introduce is reductionism. And this is basically believing that all of our behaviours are the result of stimulus-response connections, associations, stimulus response, and therefore the behaviourists believe that we are like a black box, so that we don't have any organism factors really that are playing a role in our behaviour. So in other words, what goes in is the stimulus and we just respond to it, right? So unlike the cognitive approach, they ignore the O, the organism, the mediating factors that come between the stimulus and response. So reductionist as in S are connections. Third one we're going to talk about is Darwinism. And what we mean there is that because we are so similar to animals, we can test on animals and make comparisons between the animals and humans. So the behaviour is very heavily influenced by Darwin, and believing that we are just further along the evolutionary tree, so we are so similar that it is acceptable to do research on animals because we're going to be physiologically very similar to them in terms of our brain, and therefore our behaviour, it follows, is also similar. So Darwinism, we can refer to that as Darwinism. A fourth one that we're going to talk about today is empiricism. And what we mean by that is that they believe that only overt, observable behaviour is worthy of study, that we should be completely objective. We should be using very controlled lab experiments, for example, in order to gather our data. And it's only that overt, very observable and therefore very objective data that is worthy of any study. Anything subjective, anything internal, so internal mediating processes are irrelevant according to them, that we should be just focused on what we can actually see, because if we can see it, we can verify it. So in this empiricism, key facts, as we've said, only overt observable behaviour, and the idea being that we want to make causal links, and it's only through for example, in an experiment, a lab experiment, very controlled, we can get rid of extraneous variables, we can quantify our data, and we can make these causal links, cause-effect links. So those are our key assumptions, those are the ones we need to mention. Plenty of information there, and let's go on now to classical conditioning and have a look at what we need to cover with this. Okay, so keywords for classical conditioning. Classical conditioning deals with associations being made up, and we are talking about reflexive behaviours. Okay, so reflexes, automatic behaviours, not voluntary behaviours. Obviously research, the most important research really is from Pavlov with his dogs salivating. So as we know, Pavlov, Russian scientists, found and noticed that his dogs were salivating not only for food, but also they started to salivate at the preparation for that food. So food dishes, food, the light, the people who fed them. So they started salivating even before the food arrived. Okay, so that led him to investigate this physiological response. So in a past exam question, they also asked us the method, how would he investigate that? And that was really about the, making sure he had quantifiable measures of the salivation, for example, very controlled, set up very controlled conditions. And they were after, again, that very important method question that seems to be coming up a lot. So ensuring that you can outline for 3 marks what was the method used. So Pavlov. Right, I've got here the diagrams. So we're going to refer to our classical conditioning sort of equation here. Let's have a look at this one. We're going to zoom in on Pavlov's first of all. So, and look at some of that key terminology. Okay, so what we have here, can I expand that a little bit? Okay, so before conditioning, the dog does not salivate. It just salivates to food. It does not salivate to a bell. So before conditioning, we just have UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, the food, which gets the response of an unconditioned response of salivation. And then the bell, this could be anything, but in this case, what this example is the bell. It's a neutral stimulus. So whatever it is that you're introducing is the neutral stimulus. A dog will not automatically salivate at a bell, okay? But you're pairing up the food with the bell and food here to get this response. So unconditioned stimulus, the food, the bell is the neutral one, and we get the unconditioned response of salivation. So after some pairings, we will have a conditioned stimulus of the bell actually getting the conditioned response, the salivation. So that was with Pavlov. We've also got cases with Watson and Rayner, as you probably know, with the little boy, little Albert, getting conditioned to be afraid of white. Well, in fact, it ended up being white, or lots of white fluffy things, but particularly the key thing is the rat, the white rat. So before conditioning, little Albert was not afraid of white rats. Okay, and Watson and Rayner in the 1920s decided they wanted to see whether they could condition him. So what they did was they hit a metal bar close to his head. Be careful with your wording. I've seen some bizarre responses in exams with this. They didn't hit the baby's head, obviously, but they are hitting a steel bar behind the baby's head to make it frightened. So its natural response, its natural reflex is a fear response. Okay, so loud noise, UCS, leads to fear response, UCR, unconditioned response. All right, we pair that up with a neutral, in this case was a white rat, and we get the fear response. And eventually, after a number of pairings, the white rat on its own will get this conditioned response, okay, of fear response. And as you know, Watson and Rayner then generalized that to other things like cotton wool and Father Christmas face, Father Christmas beard, etc., etc. So let's minimize this a little bit so we can see some other key terms that we're going to be needing. One thing I would say, be careful. They like this as an application question in the exam. And for example, if a child is, I don't know, afraid of hospitals or needles or whatever, children are not born like that. And therefore, whatever it is that they're asking you to outline, that is the neutral stimulus. So it's useful for you to start with a bottom line. Okay, we know that what the end result will be is that they're afraid of, they're telling you they're already, that they are afraid of, for example, needles or spiders or going to hospital. So your bottom line will be hospital leads to a fear response. We know that the hospital is the neutral stimulus, so we've just got to work out what our conditioned response will be. And if it's a hospital, it's because whatever medication probably they're taking leads to feeling afraid, feeling nauseous, and therefore fear. So then we're pairing that up with the hospital. Same with needles. A child is going to become afraid of needles because of the pain of that. Dog bite, loud barking, pigeons. We've had things like that in the exam, and that is, something flapping in your face is going to lead to a fear response. Flapping and pigeon or bird let loose, etc., fear response, and so on. Okay, so do the bottom line first is my recommendation. Okay, so going back to these key terms which are important for us to be aware of. So let's look at time contiguity. Look at the spelling that, time contiguity. Basically, that is, according to classical conditioning, that these two stimuli should occur together in time, or very close together in time, in order for the association to occur. Okay, so classical conditioning believes they do need to occur very close together in time. And then we've got generalization and discrimination, a couple of other terms. So let's just run through those. So with generalization, what we find is that the same response, conditioned response, can occur with very similar stimuli. All right, so we get a new association. So for example, with little Albert, it was the white rat that he was afraid of initially, but that could be generalized very quickly to white cotton wool, white Santa Claus mask or beard, etc., etc. All right, so we can generalize, and that means that we have the same response to very similar stimuli. Discrimination, on the other hand, is that there is this cutoff point where we won't learn that association, where we don't associate something that's very similar. So, for example, we've learned to discriminate one sound from another similar sound. For example, your, ringtones on your phones, you might have a similar ringtone to somebody else, particularly in the old days where people didn't put them on, on silent or vibrate, whatever. We all had different ringtones, but we could discriminate. We knew that when there was a phone going off, it wasn't ours, because although it might sound similar, it was somebody's phone, it wasn't our phone, it wasn't our ringtone. Generalization, an example of that is probably a good example is a fire alarm. You don't need to be in to know what it sounds like in a shop or in a new school. If a certain alarm goes off and it's a continuous bell, that is showing that it is to be you should respond as alarmed to that, and you should get out. So we have learned to generalize certain stimuli, and here we've learned to discriminate certain stimuli. And then last little bit here is higher order conditioning. So higher order conditioning is basically that we can create a second conditioned response from our first one. So if I show you an illustration here. So just zoomed in on this. An example here that a cat has learnt to associate, let's say, a particular can opener with food. All right, so it has already got that conditioned response. So here's our conditioned stimulus. We've already got existing one associated with our unconditioned stimulus. So we get an unconditioned response there. Let's say that we've already conditioned this one. Okay, we're pairing that up. That's a conditioned response. They've already learnt that when they use this can opener, it means food is coming. So that can be paired up with any other neutral stimulus. So for example, the example here is a squeaky cabinet door, right, where the food is kept or whatever. And that paired up with the can opener, so the cat then has learnt to salivate to get ready for that. Okay, so we basically would have, the previous one would have been that we've got our this has been paired up with food. So food would have been our unconditioned stimulus, give salivation, just like we had with Pavlov. Food plus the neutral. This initially would have been the neutral stimulus, and then this has become the conditioned stimulus. But all we need to do now is pair that up with some other neutral stimulus, and we get the conditioned response. And that's what happens in real life, as you've probably seen with your own pets. So going on now, let's have a look at operant conditioning and the key terms that we need for this. So operant conditioning is all about consequences of people's behaviour. Operant conditioning is about voluntary behaviour, okay, as opposed to reflexes. And as I say, it is about the consequences of behaviour. And the person associated with that, as you know, is Skinner. So let's have a look at what the key terms that we need for Skinner. All right, so Skinner talked about behaviour being shaped and maintained by its consequences. Behaviour is shaped and maintained by its consequences. And he talked about positive and negative reinforcement. I'm going to run through these because students often get them muddled up. Reinforcement, remember, reinforcement always strengthens behaviour. By definition, it is strengthening behaviour. What do we mean by that? It means that it is making that behaviour more likely to occur. So positive reinforcement is when you get something nice, which will strengthen your behaviour. So you always need to make sure you're saying strengthening behaviour whenever you're talking about reinforcement, whether it's positive or negative. Okay, so positive, you're getting something good when you do the behaviour. Okay, so when you have actually performed that behaviour, you get something nice, and that increases the likelihood of you doing that same behaviour again. Negative reinforcement, again, it's a reinforcer, so we're always strengthening behaviour, but this time it's taking away something aversive, something unpleasant, which will encourage your that same behaviour. So for example, with negative reinforcement, one good example to use is maybe a headache. All right, so let's say I have a headache, I take paracetamol, my headache goes away. So I have been negatively reinforced. Which behaviour is negatively reinforced? It's my paracetamol taking behaviour. Okay, so next time I have a headache, I'm most likely going to reach for the paracetamol to take away that nasty effect, the headache. Positive reinforcement, you guys know, you do some good homework, you get some sort of plaudit, some sort of commendation, some sort of star or whatever you call it, and that will increase, hopefully, the chance that you'll behave in that same way, that you'll do the same thing again, you'll perform well on your test or your homework or whatever. So that's positive reinforcement. Punishment is the opposite, so be careful with this. Punishment, think about it, you're always trying to weaken behaviour, you're trying to stop the behaviour. So we can have positive and negative punishments. You don't really need to know that, but basically punishment, just bear in mind, it is either giving something unpleasant, like detention, yeah, possibly a smack, something like that, which, you know, we wouldn't advocate that, but punishment would be, you know, giving something pleasant to stop the behaviour. Or punishment can be also taking away something nice. So taking away your pocket money, taking away your freedom, in other words, gating you, something like that. Again, the intent is to stop the behaviour. Skinner said that reinforcement is so much more powerful, and we can see that because with reinforcement, you're shaping the behaviour you want. With punishment, all you're doing is showing them what you don't want, but that's not that effective because actually, at the end of the day, you want them, you know, to do the right thing. Okay, so he talked about successive approximations. This is shaping behaviour by getting the animal, the child, whoever, to do roughly the right thing, and you reinforce them, and then you shape it a little bit more. So for example, a dog, teaching a dog, maybe dogs that help disabled people to, on command, be able to turn on a light. You would need to get them close to the wall where the light switch is, you reinforce them. You get them to jump up a little bit, you reinforce them. You get them to jump up higher, you reinforce them. You get them to respond and jump on command, jump or light or something like that, you reinforce them. And so approximate behaviours and successive, one after the other, so successive approximations. So he said in that way we are shaping behaviour. And obviously whatever positive consequences will be repeated. That is key. Positive consequences are repeated. Be careful, it's not saying the same thing here, but basically with positive and negative reinforcement, all of those are going to be positive consequences. Even if I get rid of my headache, that is a positive consequence. Okay, so positive consequences will be repeated, but be careful with your wording. And obviously we had Skinner with Skinner box there with his training his rats and his pigeons in different ways. Rats to press a lever, pigeons to peck a disc, And basically, every time they did the behavior he wanted, the approximate behavior, he reinforced them. So eventually he trained pigeons to effectively, in inverted commas, read, to turn on command, etc., etc. Okay, but all he was doing was shaping their behavior. Okay, so whizzing through now, we want to just make a note perhaps of the differences between classical and operant. Key difference, I would say, is making sure that you're talking about reflexive versus voluntary behavior. So remember, classical deals with reflexes, whereas operant deals with voluntary behavior. And you could, if you need a second one, maybe talk about how the unconditioned stimulus works. So for example, in classical, the unconditioned stimulus works in the same way regardless of whether the behavior is pleasurable or not. So if we think about that, we're pairing up a neutral stimulus with something that is, food, so that's a reward, but it could equally be something aversive. So in addiction, and if we're talking about alcohol abuse and the treatment for that, we might pair up antabuse, which makes you vomit, with alcohol. So that's not a nice response, but it's working in exactly the same way as something where you are getting something pleasurable, like food. Okay, whereas with operant conditioning, obviously it works only, it's the positive consequences that are going to get the desired response. It's positive consequences that have the response, okay, that are that are being reinforced, that encourage that same behavior. Right, let's move on to the evaluation, because I'm not sure how much time I've got here, but with the evaluation, let's say, right, great thing about it, it's highly scientific, and obviously that provides evidence for psychology as a science. It gives it scientific credibility because the measures they use are very objective. If we think about that, finding causal links, science expects us to be able to falsify, to operationalize, to find causal links, etc., etc. So the behaviorists, because they're using scientific methods like experiments, really objective measures, then they will, it does provide more scientific credibility. We could also say that another strength is that it heavily influenced educational policy in the 50s, because basically it allowed people to realize that if nurture is so important and we are the result of our environment, and schools and colleges and societies should be educating their young, providing good, enriched environments for their young people, because it's a matter of nurture over nature, as opposed to previous thinking, which was that certain people had an educational limit, and providing them with education wasn't going to help. And obviously we realize now that's ridiculous. That's not true. Obviously practical applications, another strength. Advertising, you can see that with your classical conditioning examples, with adverts. We've got also treatment programs. So for example, systematic desensitization. So treatment programs, for example, with addictions. So systematic desensitization used, for example, also with phobias. We can have, we learn to associate relaxation. We've got the hierarchy, and we build a hierarchy of fear. And the idea is it's really important that people are made to be relaxed, and then they gradually introduce the feared items from very small level to higher level, whilst ensuring the person is relaxed. And so the idea is that the person who has a phobia is learning to associate the feared item but with relaxation as opposed to fear, okay, because we can't have two conflicting emotions occurring together. You can also bring in the token economy, used in hospitals, used in schools, for example, star charts and things like that. When somebody does something, the behavior that is desired, they're given some sort of token. In primary schools, that's often things like a gold star, and you stick the star on a chart, and eventually those all add up to having some sort of treat. Same thing in hospitals, for example. It has been used with people with eating disorders. We also can use this with training, for example, pets. If you've got a dog, you've most likely used this by reinforcing it, giving it lots of attention, praise, treats, biscuits, whatever. Ditto with children. Okay. So they've got some nice strengths, but with weaknesses. Key thing, perhaps, comparing it with the cognitive approach. Remember, behaviorists believe in SR, that black box. Cognitive obviously reject that for an SOR, O being the organism, in other words, you, the person, and what is happening between the stimulus and the response. In other words, the mediating factors that come between stimulus and response. In other words, things like paying attention, being motivated in the case of SLT, and attention retention, for example, motor reproduction, but also your thought processes, language, memory, all sorts of other things that will come between the stimulus and response. So in other words, we think and we don't automatically behave in a specific way, in the same way. Okay, so it's important to make that comparison. Likewise, comparison with SLT. Behaviorists say that we have to directly learn things. SLT say we can observe and we can indirectly, in other words, vicariously learn from other people's experiences. And there's plenty of evidence to support that. We don't have to learn from our own experience. We can watch somebody else learn and learn, for example, through that. And again, SLT believing that we have mediating factors like the fact that we need to be motivated to copy a behavior. We've also got problems with using animals because we are qualitatively different, some people would argue. So, for example, with attachment theory, maybe with Harlow's monkeys, we have a different gestation period. We have our attachment is most likely going to have a lot more cognitive input. That's just one example, but plenty of different examples, but be specific about what could be different in terms of whichever topic you're talking about. Problems also with determinism, that most people accept that we do have some free will, and determinism is quite a negative view because it suggests that we can't have an input, we can't make change. And it's really important for people to realize that, and it's so important for people to realize that they have choice in their own lives and that they can make a difference by changing their behavior. Otherwise, we would just assume that we can't do anything, and we need to believe that we have free will. It's important for our own mental health that we realize we have free will. And you could link in with the locus of control and the fact that if you have more of an internal locus of control, you believe that you have more choice over not obeying, not conforming, etc., etc. So plenty of areas you could link in with that. And that is it in a nutshell. Bit fast. Hopefully that's helped you.